Technology, artificial intelligence, and digital services have been progressing at a rapid rate and have been accelerated hugely by lockdown. Many businesses have either transitioned to or maximized their digital products and services, while virtual currencies have become increasingly prevalent. But consumer trust is often a hard-won and vital component for businesses' use of data and AI that lies behind these services. So demonstrating responsible use of both is essential. The uses of data collected by businesses are endless, and AI only increases those possibilities. So how do businesses ensure their use of data and technologies are responsible rather than purely for profit? There are many examples of responsible uses of AI. Lloyds Banking Group have used AI to identify more vulnerable customers in the telephone queues for their call center and bump them to the top. And IBM have worked with DHL to reduce their carbon emissions by applying machine learning to their data that can identify inefficiencies in their logistics. Research at the Lloyds Banking Group Centre for Responsible Business shows that AI-led carbon calculating and reporting could not only help businesses hit their decarbonisation targets, but also help develop public policy in this area. Indeed, AI will be crucial to the UK government's new 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution, helping plan and manage the rollout of renewable energy, provide ESG data that supports greener finance, and monitor and protect our natural environment. So, can AI, data and technology help your business with post-COVID recovery? The answer depends largely on how you plan to use it. Using data and artificial intelligence to identify and help fix previous irresponsible decisions and make new positive pathways of responsible behavior is key.
Hello and welcome. It's my pleasure to introduce our panel of experts for the Lloyds Banking Group Centre for Responsible Business discussion on AI data and trust. Here to share their expertise and insights with businesses, organisations, academics and students are Linda Bresciento, an experienced UK data privacy professional and also working as interim group head of privacy in the Chief Data Office at Lloyds Banking Group. Areet Chowdhury, Senior Policy Advisor at the Royal Society, focusing on data and digital technologies, and also founder of WebRoots Democracy. Manjula Lee, founder and Chief Executive Officer of Worldwide Generation and the G17 Eco Platform. And Seamus Ray, co-founder and CEP at Engine B. Seamus very much focused on leveraging AI and data to transform organisations. Welcome everybody and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
So first question, let's dive straight in for our panel of experts today is the fact that many organisations are still grappling at this point in time with a simple question, and that is who should be taking the lead on responsibility for ethical practice in AI?
In our organisation, we care very much about data and AI and the ethical position, but we have a head of ethics within the organisation, and she reports to me, but also has a direct line to one of the non-execs on the board, as well as everybody in the business has an ability to go on ethics around data and AI to her or to me. Or they can bypass both of us and go straight to the non-exec on the board. So we actually have a head of ethics, but I think it's a board-owned agenda as well. So I think everybody at the senior level does. In fact, everybody in the whole organisation does. But you need to be able to create the right routes for them to be able to resolve the problem.
I'm happy to also provide a view of our position at Lloyds Banking Group. I'm currently actually head of privacy, ethics and record management. So this means that we, in the Chief Data Office, we have taken the lead on developing the data strategy for ethics. And as was pointed out, it's important to know that we are, although I'm directly reporting to the Chief Data and Analytics Officer, I'm always, I have the ability to influence at board level when attending meetings and a Chief Data Office or Group Data Office, whereby we can actually influence directly with executives. But at the same time, it's very important that data ethics, I think it's embedded within the processes, and it's there is a data culture awareness across the wider organization. So it's very much starting with the people working with data, I think. So data scientists, data analysts. And so we can lead the strategy, but it's equally important to ensure that it's practiced on a daily basis. And we to kind of try to push it through the organization, we have embedded our ethical principles in our data science life cycle. So we have included a set of considerations, for instance, data ethics considerations, as part of the requirements that those who create the models need to complete and consider in order to move to the next stage of development. So it's now naturally embedded into the process, so that it has to be taken into account as a natural step.
Thank you, Linda. And some of the work that you're doing there at Lloyds, it really does elevate the whole issue in a very positive sense of ethics and AI. But what about some of the smaller companies? Seamus, I don't know whether you want to add from your perspective in relation to smaller companies who might just be starting out, thinking how can they leverage AI perhaps in order to grow their business post-COVID. How can they make a start? From
an ethics point of view?
Yes.
Yeah, so it's kind of, when we started Engine B, we started off, the first thing we did was the staff handbook, right, before we did anything else. And in there was all about the values of the business. And to Linda's point, it's a cultural thing, it's a process thing, it's a governance thing. And I don't think you're ever too small not to have that laid out in for us in the staff handbook. So it's part of the culture, it's part of the onboarding when you join the organization. There's a structure in terms of who you should go to if you've got an issue, and then there's an escape route to somebody outside of your line. So I actually think that this is something which is ingrained from the start. And I know it feels heavy-handed, but actually, if you start off in the wrong way, then actually any development you do around AI is just going to come undone. So it feels like a base, what's the right expression? Almost a hygiene factor in the Maslow's theory of needs, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Manjula, in terms of the sectors that you have done a great deal of work with in the past, and I'm thinking in particular here about NGOs, the not-for-profit sector, might it differ in terms of the approach to ensure that there is some kind of framework there, perhaps, whereby that sense of responsibility isn't just spoken about, but it's actually felt, experienced, and embedded into the culture of an organization? How does that fit into the NGO sector?
Yeah, if I might actually go 30,000 feet a bit higher than that, I think that anyone who's starting an organization, whether that be for-profit, non-profit, governmental, really from the leadership down has to embed its own backbone, if you will, of ethics, right? From whether you're implementing technology across the organization, or whether you're implementing AI or any type of implementation, everything can be used for good or not good, right? And it has that balance that we all as leaders have to make that decision pretty much every day. Which way are we going to use that type of process or that type of system or that type of data? And so from my perspective is that actually there needs to be something even at a higher level, who's going to take the lead is it the regulators? Is it the governments that are going to take a lead to say that actually every organization, whether you start it, every leader has to have a charter that it has to stick by, right, when implementing any type of technology. And really the reason we started Worldwide Generation was this very reason, that no one could get access to trusted, comparable, timely data that was really evidence-based, immutable. And that's why we built this platform, G17 Eco, to accelerate the financing and delivery of the SDGs and the Paris Agreement. And when we were trying to work out what's the missing link, the issue was no one could execute. How do they measure their performance, sustainability? What are the metrics, etc.? Because no one could execute. A lot of the data was coming from public scraping data. So a lot of this data was just being harvested and then sent to the different stakeholders for trillions of dollars of decision making off the back of this data. And then, the layer underneath that was because no one could get access to trusted, comparable, timely data. No one could measure impact, what was working, what was not working, and where to invest, divest, manage risk, etc. So from my perspective, where we're about to probably fall off a cliff at the moment as a global race is that we are about to put AI over dirty data. And that is the fundamental issue we're about to face now. And I think if we're talking about sustainability and building back better, particularly out of COVID, the number one theme, if you look at it, has been all about, can I trust this information? Can I trust this data? Can I trust my leader? Can I trust, what everyone's telling me? And the dissemination of untrusted data at the moment has caused probably one of our biggest crises in human history now. And so I really feel that there has to be a charter for how data is collected, how data is sourced, and then the trust of that data in the first place, because we are going to be, we've got 9 years before irreversible decline of the planet, right? If we do not get this data set in a good place, and then make sure that the practices of how do we harvest that data and use that data with AI or any type of technology, we're gonna go even further backwards. And so that would be my 30,000 foot view, is that actually it's not just about having good processes in an organization. Those can be quick. We've heard of so many people who are on ethics committees being fired because they spoke up about a certain issue. But that's because there's nothing sitting above them to protect them from being able to speak out about issues like this. So I hope that kind of answered your question, but just at a much higher level.
In a very holistic way. Thank you, Manjula. Arik, looking from your perspective, I'm thinking here, perhaps particularly with the work that you have done around Web Roots Democracy, when you are thinking about the kind of data on which AI is based, to pick up on Manjula's point there, what measures can be taken to ensure that what is being scraped isn't dirty data, that it's not fake in some way? Surely this is now the very first challenge for AI.
Yeah, thank you, Hazel. Yeah, I totally agree with everyone's points so far. What I would add is, with ethics, it's very different in tech than it is with other fields. If you look at medicine, law, journalism, accountancy, once upon a time I was an auditor at KPMG, so I'm sure Seamus is quite familiar with the ethics involved in accountancy. Ethics is a real tangible thing that you can measure and enforce. So you enforce it, for example, in the ICAW exams, every module will talk about ethics. In medicine, you can be struck off if you do something unethical in your field, and you have similar mechanisms in other fields. The difference with technology, which I think is a real inherent challenge here, is that anyone can build the next, big thing, big AI product, the next Facebook, let's say, and there's no sort of coherent pathway into that. There's no institute of computer scientists where you have enforced regulations. You don't get struck off, you don't get hired based on whether you've passed a certain exam. And that's where the real challenge, as well, one of the big challenges is, right? So how do you get a situation where actually you can enforce ethics across the board? And I think that's one of the big challenges. But to your questions around looking at the sort of dirty data, one of the projects I did at Web Roots Democracy looked at facial recognition surveillance, which you may have read about in the news. It's quite a controversial application of AI, and essentially involves scanning the faces of a crowd in order to search for a criminal. And there are lots of controversies about how this works. There's a few studies in America which show that due to the lack of good quality data that's trained up a lot of these facial recognition systems, they work better on white people than black people. And that's because they're trained on more images of white people. If you go on Google Images, you'll find more images of white people than black people. And that's one of the issues, right? One of the issues is, how can we make these systems, if we have them, more accurate? And that could be, training them on better data sets. But the research I did took a step back actually and said, even if we have good, high quality data, and even if these systems work accurately, are they still ethical? Because then the next question is, how are these systems actually used? Like, what are they being used for? So with surveillance and facial recognition, it wasn't so much that these cameras won't work accurately on everyone. It was, who are these cameras going to be targeting? Who's going to be on the watch list? How is the watch list defined? So if you look at other areas of policing, it's well known that there's, people of color are more likely to be stopped and searched, be tasered. And so if you look at all of these other tools and other methods of policing, you'll see disproportionate impacts. And therefore, new technologies, even if they work accurately, and even if they're trained on high quality data, can still be used in quite unethical ways. So we also have to take this quite holistic view of the technology. What is the actual purpose we're doing? What are we actually trying to achieve? And then think about, how do we actually enforce a lot of these good practices we want to see?
Thank you. Again, you've opened up so many different areas that we can now move on with in terms of the direction in which AI and ethics is moving at this point in time. But, thinking about a utopia where we could actually ensure somehow that we were only scraping clean data, let's just think about that point in terms of responsibility. So we can talk about responsibility, we can talk about frameworks, we can talk about charters, but to what extent are we seeing judgment around the source of data being included in organizational charters? Or is this where we very much do need the kind of legislation, the kind of regulation that thus far only very few countries have gone down the path of pursuing? And I'm talking here about legislation which would make it easier to insist that sources of fake data and fake news, for that matter, are removed.
I'm not into the fake news piece, Hazel, but just because you kind of talked about regulation around the quality of data, we fundamentally believe that, and to Manjula's point, which is absolutely spot on around the quality of the data out there, you can't tell what's good, what's not good, etc. But we believe that all data should come with lineage, right? So you should be able to work out where that data came from, and actually the source of that data, and effectively the controller, the owner of that data, right? And also with lineage, it should come with what it's allowed to be useful as well. So that the data is not just simply my name, my face, whatever, but actually it's come from this data set. The data set is owned by this person. The people in this data set are given permission for the following types of training to be done. And you start, if you start doing that, then you can start having an understanding about the quality of the data to a greater extent. And the other reality about data is even if it's not poor quality data, it's bound to be data in lots of different formats, right? So as you normalize that data, as you take the data from one data set and you normalize it into all the images are of the same format, etc., then you need to know how it's been changed, right? So otherwise, again, it becomes an ethical issue of, you know, one set of data may have a greater influence because it's in high definition, right? So So you kind of go, these are the kind of rules. Now, do we need to have that and a lot of other rules like that embedded into regulation? Possibly. I think Eric's point about the ICW, which sits on my board for ethical reasons, for exactly that reason, right? So, and they are there to represent the accounting industry to make sure that our purpose is met before profit, right? We have a very clear purpose before profit mentality, and we have the ICW there to make sure we do that. In our purpose is our ethics, etc. But so you know, an association or a regulator kind of laying down those rules, I think with association would be more powerful. If we had exams and disbarment, that'd be even better. And if not, if we can't do that, then regulation it is.
We need to consider that we have data protection legislation and data privacy laws, you know, worldwide, in GDPR in Europe. But and this legislation actually have a number of principles that cover some of the elements that we have touched so far. So, for instance, accuracy of data is one of the key principles. Data minimization, fact that data has to be used only for what is strictly necessary, and also some requirements around sourcing of data and the quality of data are covered by existing legislations. However, I think that data ethics goes beyond actually the laws and what is actually required by the regulations, because it's about really understanding how data is used and manage to deliver a fair, explainable, and non-discriminative outcomes for everyone. And we see that regulation are starting to, and data privacy regulations in particular, are starting not to be covering all of the challenges that are arising lately, as it was mentioned, facial recognition and technologies, but there are a number of ethical mishaps that have been identified and are very much linked to the nature of algorithms and mathematical models, because, as you know, very often the logic behind an algorithm is invisible to all but the designers, which means essentially we need to put our trust in their hands, as we do every time we take a flight or we enter a building which we expect to be built following certain standards. So I think we need to really, the key issue here for me is that compliance with the laws is the baseline, but it still leaves a lot of ground for unethical behavior. And unless we kind of have a key, at least high-level principles around ethical data sourcing and sharing, ethical design and purpose, and explainability and transparency that are clearly set up and valid for everyone, it's very difficult to understand how they could be enforced. We need to start with best practices, and hopefully this will lead to, you know, the development of high-level principles at legislative level. But for instance, from the perspective of an organization, I think we need to be very careful what we wish, because very detailed regulations could actually stifle innovation sometimes if they are too detailed, and if they, you know, technology continues to evolve over time, and sometimes regulations are cannot keep pace with the evolution of technology. So this is why personally I think that having you know, a principle-based approach, as I think this is the approach at least a European level has been taken with European guidelines on ethical and trustworthy AI, which have been published last year. And it's very similar. I've seen the same approach taken across other organizations, other jurisdictions. I think that will leave more space, to allow, allow organizations to embed the requirements while at the same time have clear objectives that needs to be met.
And when we think about COVID-19 and note the way in which that has brought purpose, we've been discussing purpose, the way in which it has placed purpose center stage on a level that we've never seen before. I think it's really interesting to note how through this, how the pandemic has often proved to be this stark reminder of a need to transition into more equal and resilient organizations and ultimately societies as well. But what I want to ask here really is about how AI is also proving essential in delivering transitions like this, and how the pandemic is exposing limits, for example, in research and innovation at this point in time. And if these aren't addressed, there's a suggestion that could prevent organizations and societies from perhaps realizing a more sustainable way forward. So what does the panel think should be done to better enable research that will help and support organizations in a post-COVID world?
Hazel, can I take that one?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I loved how you started the question with the purpose bit, because I'm going to say something a bit controversial now, because what is the purpose of AI, machine learning, and having everything interconnected, automated, augmented? What is the purpose of all of that? I want to go back to, because, us as human beings, the way that we make decision making, 95%, actually even higher, is unconscious, right? And the way that we make decisions is by absorbing data. So, and we write programs in our brain, right? So we actually take all this information and we build stories and programs in our subconscious brain. And that brain has cognitive biases built into it. So it favors the now instead of the future. It favors loss instead of gain, etc. And that's to keep our fight or flight system alive, right? And that's how we breathe and we make decisions. So what's interesting about it is that if we're in a world right now where what we have over human beings and machines is that we have the emotional ability in our decision making as well as human beings. Now, if we're building a whole a global machine, right, that's going to start making decisions on our behalf, that makes me think, well, why are we doing that? And we're asking those decisions to be ethical potentially as well. Now, we've seen already that there's cognitive biases in a lot of the data that we're seeing, a lot of the information we're seeing, and that has been programmed by human beings, right? We put in certain cognitive biases into algorithms, etc. So my whole thing is that, have we really stopped to think about what is it that we're doing with this technology? And what is it that we're putting in the hands of machines? Because I think there is absolutely a need for certain sectors to evolve and transition and build back better and accelerate with machine and machine learning and AI. But at the same time, there is certain things that we shouldn't put in the hands of the machine. We should be absolutely leading from a human perspective with the ethics, with the morality, with the decision-making processes that we have. And I think that's kind of back to the purpose question, has anyone stopped to actually think what we're about to do, and because we're going at the speed of knots with this. And we had to make that decision as well. When we started Worldwide Generation, this platform, where no one could get access to sustainability data, we could have easily just bought a whole lot of data, put it in the database, put some intelligence over it, and then sold that to different stakeholders. We said, no, we are going to collect this data from source with evidence, with an immutable chain of provenance to it, so that everyone can then see that, and not even worldwide generation can touch that data. And that was a big decision that we made, is that it's going on a distributed ledger. We can't touch that data. And I think the distributed ledger technology actually poses a really interesting tech for this time, where we're in a trustless ecosystem, right? And we have to bring trust back. So our whole thing is actually, if we are going to go down this road, make sure that the data is decentralized, is coming from source, has evidence to substantiate it, and that, there is no biases in the data. Then, okay, we use that technology, AI, ML, etc., to really advance in things like medicine, in things like, where we can predict hurricanes and things like that, right? So that's where we can use the technology to really safeguard ourselves as a human species. But where we're about to use it is actually going to be, again, set us back, I think, as well. And so there's a fundamental issue about the pace, and a lot of people are just slapping AI on things as well, right? Like AI this, AI that, and it's like, it's not really AI anyway. But that's the other thing, is that could we create a council or something? I don't know, Seamus, like all of us, create something that says, okay, what is AI applied to, and is there a wisdom council that says, actually, let's use it for this, not for this, and I think that's where I feel like we all need to go back to purpose for this whole technology.
Manjula, I have to say I completely agree. My concern is I think it's out of the box, if that makes sense. The Pandora's box is open.
Yes.
I sit on something called the Economic Singularity Club, and we talk a lot about where we could be as a human race in, and people have a view whether it's 20 years time or 50 years time, etc. But it's actually not where we could be, it's how do we get there is the issue, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
If AI does everything we want it to, and I actually passionately believe in knowledge graphs as well on top of AI, and AI in knowledge graphs, all kinds of clever things, right? But you're going to go, if it does bring a world of plenty in terms of production, services, etc., and that may be 30 years out, maybe 100 years out, maybe 20 years out. The problem is, how do we get there? And how do we as humans evolve to still have a sense of purpose as that world changes over time? And I think the problem we have at the moment is that, in a way, because government doesn't control AI, and AI is controlled much more by large organizations, we can't stop it, if that makes sense. So I think what you're saying is correct. I think it's too late.
Yeah. But I suppose as business leaders and as government leaders, as NGO leaders, as even civil society, even citizens, right?
Yeah.
Can we, our choice is our voice, right? And that's where we do need to take a stand on certain things, right? And call it out when it is happening. Because I think even by the time you're a massive company and you're getting a slap on the wrist and you're getting a penalty for, whatever, it's like, that's also too late. It's a bit like, okay, well, I'll just pay the fine and,
I think there's something about transparency is democracy, right? So if we could go
exactly
really visible about lots of different things in data, and then by making it transparent, then we can start a conversation. And I think we should be, and people, it doesn't matter whether it's large or not, we should be owning the conversation, having the conversation, but we should be open and transparent about what we're doing and the impact we're having, etc. And that should just transparency.
Transparency is the number one thing. Yeah. Number one, yeah.
Talking of which, I'd like to go to Linda now, if we can, for her to be able to share with us some of the excellent practice that we have seen coming not out of a small company, but out of a really large company, in terms of how you have set up the framework, what the steps were towards this, and perhaps more importantly, how you can maintain that level of focus now to ensure that AI and its use for your organization remains as ethical as it is, because this is the problem, isn't it? This isn't a one size fits all. It's not a fix it now and it's fixed forever. This is about constant monitoring, isn't it, Linda?
Absolutely, yes. And thank you for asking. It's a very good question. So first of all, we have try to align and build on GDPR, because some of these principles that were just mentioned, such as transparency, it's very much one of the cornerstones of GDPR. And so we didn't want to duplicate the governance, but actually rely on existing governance we already had. So as you know, with GDPR coming in 2018, organizations started massive programs to help embedding these requirements within the organization and the business. So we really wanted to, first of all, see how best we could rely on existing structures and frameworks so that we could actually deliver what we wanted from a data ethics perspective. So we have, first of all, started from there, and then we have tried to understand what were the data ethics principles, so the elements that were not covered by GDPR necessarily. So, for instance, about requirements of understanding whether bias is incorporated in data sets or in the models that we were going to develop. Although these may have been like, kind of practices that you would expect data scientists to carry out, they were not kind of mandated within the policies that we have, because in the past this was not part of key policy requirements, not stemming from the law. They were not immediately translated into a policy, an internal policy. So we actually started thinking, well, even if we don't have a regulation there, we need to have these principles, because we see that developments at international level and European level were towards the consideration of ethical requirements. But also we found that this data ethics principle actually aligned perfectly with our values. So every big organization will have some values that they will kind of want to defend or represent. And so, for instance, at Lloyd's, the mission statement that we had in the past was helping Britain prosper, or supporting sustainability target goals or responsible businesses. So we found that there was a clear alignment with goals that we already had as an organization more broadly, even if not directly linked to data ethics. So this is to say, if you start mapping what you already had as working, like GDPR frameworks and values or goals that you have as an organization, then it becomes kind of easier to start setting the agenda and start mobilizing teams within the bank and making people feel understand how important it is to actually formalize ethics into policies. So this is what we have done really in the last few years. We have engaged with a lot of stakeholders internally, but also externally by participating at industry meetings, and also we have run a customer survey actually to kind of sense check what our customers thought about our data ethics principles. So to get their view, whether just even if just in the way you phrase the principle, do they make sense? Do you think it's something that you would perceive as a valid action from us? So just we try really to understand not just internal views but the external sentiment. And then we have formalized and developed our principles and considerations. But then it was just the first step, although it required a lot of consultations and mobilization internally. It was just the first step. And the second,
sorry to interrupt, those
Sorry.
consultations, Linda, I mean, just so important, particularly those internal consultations by way of going back to the point about culture, bringing employees with you on the journey so that it's understood from the very outset. I was hoping to bring a Rick in here at this point, and also to go back to Seamus's point that it's out of the box now, and we can't put it back in. That being the case, where should we now really try to focus to take this forward, to try to ensure that we are continuing to monitor ethics and AI, that we are in the way in which Linda suggested, that we are continuing to take ownership of what is progressing, that we remain agile in our planning around AI, but also around AI and ethics with every fresh development. Where do we start?
Yeah, so I agree, first of all, that it is out of the box. So in the sense that, you know, you could be a teenager in your bedroom building an AI product now, right? It's not, you don't necessarily even have to be a large company. But I do also agree with what Manjula was saying about having a conversation about what is and isn't acceptable use. You can still have that conversation. You can still draw red lines about acceptable applications of AI. So another area I've been looking at a lot over the past few years is the emergence of deepfakes. So these are basically fabricated video and audio content, like essentially Photoshop for video. And that technology is quite nascent. There are a few viral examples out there. I worked on one myself of Jeremy Corbyn and Boris Johnson during the 2019 election. And they're fairly convincing as they are now, but it'll be 10 years really before they become indiscernible, before they become easy to make, and before they become prevalent. And they have very limited positive applications. So positive applications of deepfakes are perhaps embedding yourself into a video game as a character, or it could be for use in film, right? So they're fairly limited applications, and you could regulate those limited positive applications. So you could say, you know, if you're a content creator working with, I don't know, you're regulated in a certain way or certified in a certain way, you can create this content. But if you're creating content for malicious purposes, this should be illegal. And the biggest application of deepfakes at the moment, and the application which is driving the technology, is its use in pornography. So horrific examples of where you're stripping the data of famous, largely female celebrities and embedding them in X-rated content. So you could draw a red line and say, this is unacceptable. We will enforce regulation, make it illegal, outlaw it. Or you could look at examples like the use of AI for, you know, warfare, right? So you could have precision drones, for example, which can have all sorts of ethical ramifications. You can have a kind of, you know, race, global race towards having this technology, and whoever has that technology is basically has the modern nuclear weapon, right? In a sense, they become very vast and powerful. So you can draw distinctions. I think still, even though the technology is out of the box, you can just draw distinctions domestically and globally about what is and isn't acceptable. And if you look over time, the language around technology changes constantly, right? So if you look 100 years ago, maybe we would see, you know, cars and bicycles as examples of technology, and then maybe a radio as a form of technology, and then you have data-driven technology, and then you have AI, and then AI will just become technology, right? So it'll become, over time, I think AI will be embedded in some sort of way into most technologies. So I think what we can do as individuals, citizens, societies, governments, is to really think about those red lines. And then once you've agreed on those red lines, think about the much more harder question, which is enforcement. So how do you enforce policing in a digital world where there are crimes happening, I don't know, maybe 1,000 crimes a second, right, online, but you don't have the resources to keep up with that. You don't know who's committing those crimes. You don't know where they're committing those crimes. That's, I think, the broader future question, which we're still struggling to deal with now with even more basic forms of data extraction, misinformation, all of those sorts of negative aspects of technology.
One brief answer from each of you, if you can, on the next question. I want to ask you, it's a double-ended question. What is the value of academia in the current situation with AI ethics in terms of pushing this issue where it needs to be at the forefront of decision making from today onwards, but also in terms of making accessible to the smallest of businesses as well as the larger businesses who are developing at this point, making accessible the whole agenda around AI and ethics in terms of encouraging a wider societal conversation. So the value of academia, how important is that moving this forward? And also how important is it that we are continuing to talk about this to involve everybody? Manjula.
I'll answer your second question first. So we, on the G7 Unico platform, we've built company tracker and portfolio tracker for the companies and the investor community. We're also building city tracker and government tracker. The sustainability and the sustainable development goals give us a really good framework where we've created a harmonized digital survey, so ESG, environmental, social governance. We can send that survey into thousands and thousands and thousands of companies, right? And we are all doing the same test. We're all asking ourselves the same questions, including ourselves. And we're asking ourselves these questions and we're putting evidence to substantiate those questions. So sustainability gives us probably the greatest opportunity to collect that data from the different organizations, even the nations, even the cities, and then present that data. And we can do that to micro companies. So everyone's inclusive in this platform, right? So from the multinationals to the micro, to the non-profits, to the cities, to the governments. So we really believe if we can collect this data and create a golden source over this data, we want to open source that so then the academia, the citizens, etc., can then start to understand this data. And I think this academia probably has one of the greatest roles to play to probably not get too swayed by business, right? And actually be the neutral arbitrator of this data, right? Particularly around sustainability or ESG, environmental, social governance, right? And I think that, and actually Professor Ian Thompson from Birmingham is on our Standards Council in G17. And so we really, and so is a number of other academia, and we really want to present to them this data and say, okay, here it is. You're the kind of stewards of this data. How are you going to help people on this roadmap to build back better? And I think as I said, sustainability gives us a real opportunity. It's not just environment, it really is about the social and the governance, the ethics, and get this multidimensional data set directly from the organizations and then aggregate it up. So that's how I would answer that. And I really think, it's probably, we need academia to hold a neutral position more than ever now. I know that there's a lot of merging between academia and business and academia and government, etc. But if you could hold that neutral position, I think that would be the strongest thing that for humanity.
Seamus.
Yeah, so there's so many things I want to pick up on that. So you asked for a short answer. I'm going to try, but Manjula, I have to say I completely agree with everything you said. I do think that we should move to data coming out of companies proving their ESG position rather than questions, as it were, because I don't trust people, if I'm being honest. But to your point, Hazel, on academia, I agree with Manjula. In reality, we need to have a balance across different initiatives, and the initiative which we're working on at the moment involves people in industry, associations, regulators, what we're doing, and Birmingham, Imperial, Oxford, a university in Illinois, etc. And actually, there's a kind of common, there is a common purpose to what we're trying to do. And I think you need that balance, right? So it's a balance between academia, regulation, associations, etc. But I also go back to something else said earlier around, we need to make the data available, be more transparent about the data. And there's a project in Europe called GAIA-X, which is a German project that's going to become European, which is about a data exchange project. And it's often going, right? And I'm kind of looking at that going, we can learn lessons from that, and we can do something, you know, in the UK, which is going to be about data exchange, but keeping the data as close to the owner or in a distributed ledger, and knowing where it's come from, how it's been normalized, you know, all those things which we talked about earlier on, and making that available to academia as much as to industries, to innovative startups, and have association regulations. So we can't just do one thing, right? It needs to all come together in a you know, a data trust, regulations, academics, a sense of purpose. Crikey, I mean, how come it's taken so long to have a sense of purpose? It's taken a great kind of global threat to have some sense of purpose is ridiculous. But anyway, there you are.
So there's short answers. So we've got, there's been a lot of work done on data ethics over the past few years. So I recommend looking up Algorithm Watch's list of AI data ethics frameworks, of which they have lots covering different areas. And also recommend a paper by the Royal Society, which was published in 2017 called Data Governance Landscape Review, which looks at all of the different challenges associated with data governance, as well as the different bodies who are responsible for you know, providing frameworks and details on that. There's a lot of detail in there. And yeah, the role of academics is obviously essential. And I think in the future, where you're seeing a lot more industry collaboration between universities, is actually a great opportunity to embed a lot of these principles in practice as a condition almost of working on joint projects. And I definitely think there's huge potential for academia to play a positive role here.
Thank you. And a final word from Linda.
Yes, thank you. I think the value of academia is key. We have relied on academic thinking, for instance, to refine our principles, and we will continue to do so. In terms of data ethics, or the organization often don't have the resources and the time to deep dive complex issues such as fairness or explainability. So it's important to be able to rely on independent views. At the same time, I think it's equally important to collaborate in order to achieve the same goal. And initiatives like this one are a great example, I think, of how industry and academia can work together and bring to the table different perspectives and considerations, as well as create synergies. So thank you.
Thank you to everyone. I'm sure the delegates will want to join me in thanking our panel of experts today. It really does feel as though we've only just begun to scratch the surface of this fascinating topic. When we think about the areas that we've covered, with particular note around how COVID has placed purpose center stage, and how that has really piqued interest. It seems very much as though the time is now for thinking ahead about, if not a restrictive framework, as we discussed, then perhaps, as one panel member called it, a red line, perhaps some guiding principles that would help all organizations, no matter what their size, to consider how they need to put purpose into their AI going forward, and how they need to think ethically with every new use and with every piece of data on which they're building AI. So thank you to our panel of experts. Linda Brigento, Lloyd's banking lead on the group's ethical data, of course. Arik Chowdhury, also an alumnus of University of Birmingham, I should add. Manjula Lee, CEO of Worldwide Generation, who of course is also doing some project work for the Lloyd's Banking Group Centre for Responsible Business, and Seamus Ray, co-founder and CEP of Engine B. Thank you so much for joining us today.